Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Tip of the Ice-Burgh podcast, your home for Pittsburgh Penguins news and analysis. You can find us on YouTube at Tip of the Ice-Burgh, or you can check us out anywhere you get your podcast from. We're live on Tip of the Ice-Burgh on YouTube, as we are every single Wednesday afternoon at 2 p.m. If you're new to the live, well, just drop your question in the comment section. We'll get to it at the end. If you are a recurring listener or viewer of this live stream, then you know what to do. Drop your question and we'll get to them at the end of this show. But we got a good show for you guys today leading into the Q&A. The Penguins, it's been rough out west. 2-4 on this road trip, 1-3 in the Pacific time zone. They got one game left on this season-long 7-game trip. That's later tonight against the Utah Hockey Club. We'll see if the Penguins cannot embarrass themselves on national television, as that one is going to be on TNT. We'll get into that one silver lining, though, on what we've seen out west in just a second. And then we'll follow that up with our 3 stars of the week, as we do every week. So let me know in the comment section that as well. Who are your 3 stars? I know there's only been 3 goals this past week, but let me know your 3 stars. Let me tell you, I'm sure you're having as hard of a time as I did trying to pick out 3 players over the past 3 games. But let's kick things off here with a little discussion about a silver lining that I think all of us are seeing over the last 3 games. It's been a tough watch, especially the 10:30 p.m. starts have been brutal. Luckily, tonight's at 9:30, a little bit of solace in that, but they've looked horrendous over the last 3 games, 3 consecutive losses to some bottom feeders in the Western Conference. Not just losses, but being outscored 11-3. Your only goal is coming from your first line and your first unit of the power play. It's been bad for the Pittsburgh Penguins against the Kraken. It's been bad for the Pittsburgh Penguins against the San Jose Sharks. It's been bad for the Pittsburgh Penguins against the Anaheim Ducks. And there is really no reason to believe that it's going to be any different later tonight against the Utah Hockey Club. Last time these 2 teams faced off was in Pittsburgh, right before the Pens got off on that great stretch between Thanksgiving and Christmas. Utah absolutely wiped the floor with the Pittsburgh Penguins. So we'll see if the Pens have a response tonight. If not, then I think we can all pretty much guess what comes next for the Pens leading into the trade deadline. But like I mentioned, and I've alluded to over the entire first 2.5 minutes of this, at the very least, there is one silver lining. And yes, maybe 2, but I think we always knew that Sidney Crosby is going to be the bright, shining star, no matter how bad the Penguins get. But outside of Crosby, the third line has looked impressive. And that's one feather in the cap for Mike Sullivan and his team. There's a lot more negative. There's a lot more on the opposite end of things. But I'm choosing to look at the positives. And the one positive that we've seen over the last 3 games is that Drew O'Connor, Kevin Hayes, and Philip Tomasino look like a pretty good unit together. Now, are they good enough to make up for the fact that you really don't have a second line? No. Are they good enough to make up for the fact that your defense has been spotty and shoddy at best? No. Does it make up for the fact that you've lost 3 consecutive games to 3 teams in the bottom of the Western Conference? No. But it does give you some hope that the Penguins have a little bit of mojo coming from somewhere other than the names of Sidney Crosby, Brian Rust, and Rickard Rakell. Right now, that third line is the only line that has created any chances for the Pittsburgh Penguins on a consistent basis, game in and game out, even when the team is struggling like it has been now. 57-23 in shot attempts, which is good for 71% of the shot attempts with this line on the ice at 5-on-5. 31-7 in scoring chances and 14-2 in high danger chances. Drew O'Connor's looked really good over the last handful of games, forechecking hard, getting to pucks, getting scoring opportunities. Kevin Hayes has dished a couple of beautiful passes, and Philip Tomasino is starting to kind of find a rhythm here after he missed a handful of games with an injury. He got back. It took him a while. Now it seems like he's kind of getting back to clicking on all cylinders. So that line as a whole, they're outperforming their opponents more often than not in a very high manner. The problem is, the one poison pill in this entire conversation, they can't finish. Drew O'Connor had a breakaway and then a penalty shot. And at no point did you feel like he was going to finish and put the puck in the back of the net. There's very little hope when these guys get opportunities that they're going to be able to finish off their chances, because they haven't been able to. They've been outscored 3-0 while still out attempting, out scoring chancing, if that's the way we want to put it, out pacing everybody that they're playing. Outscored 3-0 still in that time. O'Connor himself, 0 points on this road trip. 3 points in the last 10 games, one of those being a goal, 2 of them being an assist. Kevin Hayes has 4 points in his last 10 games. That's great, but 2 of those points are on the power play. 2 of those goals are on the power play. Again, you don't ask how, you ask how many, but whenever you're grading this as a line at 5-on-5, you do have to take that into consideration. And Tomasino in his last 10 has 3 points as well, 1 goal and 2 assists. So these guys have been playing well. These guys have been giving you a little bit of hope. These guys have been a little bit of a silver lining, but they need to finish desperately. It's great whenever you're out shooting opponents 57-23. It's great whenever you're out chancing opponents 31-7, but you need to start finishing. We've seen Kevin Hayes be able to score. He has 8 on the season. We've seen Drew O'Connor go on little runs. He has 6 on the season. He had 3 at the beginning of the year in a short period of time. Then he went for a long 30-plus game drought, and then he had 3 in quick succession, and now he's back on a drought again. They need to be more consistent with their finishing. Tomasino, I think, has been the most consistent, and even him, it's been long stretches without scoring goals. So they need to find a little bit of consistency. They need to find a little bit of finish. But outside of that, I think whenever you watch the Penguins, you look at this line and you say, all right, at the very least, you know that these 3 can work well together. Tomasino's speed, O'Connor's speed and physicality has been a problem for opposing defenders. And Kevin Hayes has done a really good job of just being the veteran piece that helps keep and maintain possession, keep and maintain momentum whenever these guys have long extended offensive zone shifts. So I've really liked what I've seen out of them, and I wanted to give them a little bit of praise here to start off this Wednesday live stream. Let's jump on over to the 3 stars of the week. And like I mentioned, whenever the team has scored only 3 goals this week, it's hard to talk about the 3 stars that have emanated from those 3 games. But I did my best. I tried my best, and these are the 3 that I'm highlighting. Let's continue on the conversation that we had in the first 7 minutes. My 3rd star of the week, his first appearance in this segment all season long, I'm going to give it to Drew O'Connor. This also might be the first time I've ever given a star when it comes to a week and that long of a span. The first time I've given a star to somebody who has literally 0 points in the 3 games. He has 0 goals, 0 assists in the 3 games played this past week. But like I mentioned, that line has been one of the best for the Penguins in all 3 of those games. O'Connor himself has been playing extremely hard. He's been forechecking extremely well. And he's been one of the players that whenever you watch these games actually looks like he is engaged every single time he goes out there on the ice. That's a sad reality because you would hope these guys are getting paid a lot of money to play this game, that they would be engaged in every single shift and every single opportunity that they get out there. But more often than not, especially over the last week, it hasn't appeared that way for many of the Pittsburgh Penguins. O'Connor, he's not on that list. I think O'Connor has played really well. His forechecking, like I mentioned, has been stellar, best on the Penguins right now. And I understand that the results haven't followed. Like I mentioned, 0 points over the last 3 games. But if he continues to play this way, if he continues to create opportunities like he has over the past week plus, things will start to go in, right? Maybe not goals in abundance, maybe not becoming a 15 to 20 goal scorer like we had hoped after he had a really good year last year, but you're going to start scoring at a much more consistent level. You're going to start getting points at a much more consistent level, because if you're doing all the right things, it's hard to imagine that all 3 of them are going to stay snake bitten. Him, Hayes, Tomasino, eventually somebody's going to break through and the points will start to follow after that. So I think that if Drew O'Connor kind of holds true to what he's been doing, I think that he's going to have a really good last half of the season. And again, if he remains on the Penguins. But as of right now, he is my 3rd star of the week. 2nd star of the week, 2 assists in 2 games, and that might be a dead giveaway because there's few players that have actually played well, collected points, and actually played in 2 of the 3 games. That is Bryan Rust. Great pass to Michael Bunting in Anaheim that set up the lone goal, a goal in which at that time we thought might get them going because they were coming off of that great game in Los Angeles and they were trying everything they could to get back into that game against Anaheim. And it took a great pass from Brian Rust to Michael Bunting on the power play to beat John Gibson. Unfortunately, that was the only time that they were able to beat John Gibson. And also, unfortunately, Brian Rust went down late in the second period of that game and did not return. He also did not play in the next game against Seattle. And I think you could tell that on the top line, while Anthony Beauvillier has been playing well, and while Anthony Beauvillier has done better than expected all season long, and he's stepped up in big moments, and he's stepped up on the top line, and he's had a couple of really good games. Look no further than LA last Monday. He was a huge reason as to why they were able to upset the Kings at Crypto.com Arena. You could tell that the Penguins were missing something with Brian Rust. He comes back, didn't really miss a beat in that return game against San Jose, but I would imagine that he's better tonight than he was in San Jose. I would imagine that he gets his feet back underneath him a little bit more tonight, and I would imagine that he gets back onto that pace that he has been setting all year long in a career year. He has 19 goals, 20 assists on the season. I would be surprised if he doesn't get right back onto that pace starting tonight and moving forward. Brian Rust is the second star of the week on my list. First star of the week, and the first star most weeks for the Pittsburgh Penguins, is Sidney Crosby. 2 of the 3 goals for the Pittsburgh Penguins in the past 3 games. Crosby, who has been snake-bitten for a lot of this season when it comes to goal scoring in particular. Don't look now, but he has goals in 3 of his last 4 games, and all of them have come at even strength. So maybe now, after we've talked about it several times on the Tip of the Iceberg, after others have talked about it several times on different platforms, maybe now Sidney Crosby is saying, I will do it myself. I will light the lamp myself. I will defer to Brian Rust and Rickard Rakell whenever it calls for it. But I think Sidney Crosby is going to start shooting, even though he had been shooting a lot. He was leading the team in shots on goal for a large stretch of games. I think this is when he's finally going to break through and say, all right, I need to go to that next level, because Malkin's out. The team as a whole is struggling to score. The secondary scoring has evaporated, and it's down to the power play and the first line right now. And Sidney Crosby knows, hey, if that's the case, I need to be the one that's finishing a lot of these opportunities. So like I mentioned, goals in 3 of his last 4 games, all at even strength. And I will say this, it is a good thing that he has Rickard Rakell and Brian Rust, because there's not much help coming from anywhere else, right? We can count on Brian Rust to potentially push that 30-goal mark. We can count on Rickard Rakell this year because he has been phenomenal. And as they're starting to announce fill-ins for the Four Nations face-off, I hope that he gets the opportunity to play for Team Sweden. He was snubbed in the initial voting. Now that since then he has gone on a tear and there's some roster spots opening up, I'm hoping Rickard Rakell gets that opportunity. But outside of him, Rust, and Crosby, Pens are looking for anything from anyone. Please, a little bit of help, especially on the offensive side of the ice, because this team has scored 3 goals in their last 3 games, and it's not like they've played a lot of barn burners. But I digress to that point. 3 stars of the week, Drew O'Connor at number 3, and the graphic is looking hilarious. If you're watching us on Tip of the Iceberg on YouTube, 0 goals, 0 assists in 3 games played. But like I mentioned, the kid has been working his tail off, so I think he deserves a little bit of commendation for that. 3rd star of the week for O'Connor. 2nd star of the week is Brian Rust with 2 assists in 2 games played. And the 1st star is number 1 in your hearts, number 87 in the programs, 2 goals in 3 games for Sidney Crosby, and a number 1 star of the week. We're going to take a quick break. When we return, answering all of your questions. So if you're tuned into the live stream on Tip of the Iceberg on YouTube, make sure you drop your question in the comment section. We'll get to as many of them as possible before we head out today. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Tip of the Ice-Burgh podcast. Thank you to everybody for tuning in live on Tip of the Ice-Burgh. Remember, if you like this video, make sure you like, share, and subscribe to us on YouTube at Tip of the Ice-Burgh, or you can catch us anywhere you get your podcast from. Let's jump into the questions here, and I'm going to start with this. I know Blues Nation asked about it. Somebody else asked about it. I have not looked into prospects yet. I have very, very basic understanding of who's in the top 5 right now, but I'm not going to go into the prospects and draft picks in the top 5 and who the Pens could get and who the Penguins should get just because I haven't looked into it. I'm not going to give you guys bad information. I'm not just going to talk. So just to let everybody know right off the bat, I have not started looking into prospects, although the way the Pens have been playing, that's probably coming up here in the next week or so. So with that in mind, let's jump into the remainder of the questions. Let's start with Brandon, who says, do you think that Dubas will ever pull the trigger on a trade? He's all talk, and Sully won't play the younger players that Dubas wants. I mean, I understand where this thought process of Mike Sullivan doesn't like younger players comes from, but it's just blatantly not true at this point. Mike Sullivan doesn't like players who make mistakes. It doesn't matter what it says on their birth certificate. You look at Phil Tomasino, 23 years old. He's a fixture in the Pens lineup right now. You look at other players that have been given opportunities. Owen Pickering, he was sent down. Why? Because one, the Penguins needed a forward, and he was the only guy that was waivers exempt. And two, because there's no need to force feed him into the NHL action if he could use a couple more games at the AHL level. So I don't think that Sully hates younger players. I think that that has kind of been dispelled because now that he actually has good younger players, he's willing to give them more opportunities. I think Drew O'Connor is a guy that over the last couple of years has helped to kind of move that. But as far as your first part of the question here, Brandon, do I think Dubas will ever pull the trigger on a trade? 1,000%. If we get to March 7th, March 8th, whatever day the trade deadline is and the day after that, and there hasn't been a trade, I will be floored. I will probably have a heart attack because I will be so surprised. I'll be in such shock that my heart's going to give out. He's going to make trades. As you've noticed, the last week, the market started to heat up a little bit. Vancouver was holding a lot of people up. Colorado was holding a lot of people up. Well, Colorado pulled the trigger. Mikko Rantanen is in Carolina. And as you might have noticed, there's been a couple of other trades that have started to come through the wire. Little smaller trades, but trades nonetheless. Movement is starting to happen, and I would imagine Kyle Dubas is very active over the next month, 5 weeks, 6 weeks, leading up to the trade deadline. So I think he's going to do it. He's talked a lot, but again, you have to have a dance partner, and the market has to be going. For the most part this season, the market's been pretty quiet. Let's move over to the next question here, starting with Jay, who says, what would it take for the Pittsburgh Penguins to snag Elias Pettersson? A lot. I mean, I understand this guy is having a down season by his standing, but at the same time, this is a superstar center in the NHL. Not only that, this is a superstar center in his prime, locked into a contract that I'm not sure I'm willing to take a bet on, because right now with all that drama happening, personally, I would look at it and stay hands off. I know there's some people that have floated out the idea of JT Miller. I hate that. I would much rather Pettersson than JT Miller, but I would keep my hands off of both of them. If I was on the other end of this, like you, Jay, and said, what would it take? Because I really want Elias Pettersson. I think it starts with a first-round pick, or at the very least, it starts with one or two of your best prospects. I know that the Vancouver Canucks are in a weird position right now where one of those guys has to leave, but it feels like if one of those guys has to leave, the smart money is on JT Miller. They don't have to trade Elias Pettersson. They might want to trade Elias Pettersson. That much I don't know. That is between Jim Rutherford, Patrick Allvin, and everybody up there in Vancouver. But for Elias Pettersson, it is going to take a haul, and a haul that I don't think the Penguins are going to be willing to trade and part with. Let's go over to Scott, who says, hey, Nick, if the Penguins stay on this path, do you see Sully being fired at the end of this season? That's a tough one, because whenever you look at coaches and whenever you look at, when and if the hot seat is turned on, a lot of that has to do with expectation. Coming into this year, what was the expectation for the Penguins? And I think I've said this a couple times on the show, so it might sound repetitive, but you asked the question, I'm answering the question. The expectation coming into this season was, if they can make the playoffs, great. but it doesn't seem like they're going above and beyond to be a playoff team when it comes to their transactions, when it comes to the moves that Kyle Dubas made. Let's not forget, last March, he traded away Jake Gensel and never replaced him. He traded away a 40-goal scorer and never replaced him. Did they luck out and Rickard Rakell has kind of stepped up his game and has given you more than expected? Yeah. Is Brian Rust giving you more than expected? Probably. Is Sidney Crosby still a point-per-game player? Yeah. But at the same time, you traded away a bona fide top six guy and replaced him with a journeyman in Anthony Beauvillier who can play at that level in the top six, but he's not a top six winger. He's never going to produce like a top six winger. You didn't get a guy in return. And then you followed it up with a lot of trades where the best thing people could say about it is it's a fresh start or it's only 1 year. Whenever you're saying those things, to me, the expectation is not playoffs. The expectation is certainly not contending for a Stanley Cup. And I think that has to be taken into account when talking about whether or not Mike Sullivan is going to be fired. I think based on what we've seen to this point, on the resume that Sullivan has put on display this season alone, take away the 2 cups. I'm not talking about that. I think it's a year-by-year thing now with Mike Sullivan. What he's put on display this season alone, to this point, as we stand here today, I don't think it's been bad enough to where they're going to move on from a guy that is beloved by the core and beloved by the ownership group. If they continue on this path and continue to lose like they've been losing on this road trip, there's a chance. I would still put it at 50-50 if they look this bad for the final 30 games of the season. If they finish in the top 5 in the NHL draft, I would still say it's 50-50 because the Penguins, organization, core, Dubas, all of them are in love with Mike Sullivan. For good or for bad, that's what I see. That's what I've gleaned upon the situation. That's what it feels like to me, that the best you're going to get is a 50-50 shot if they continue to lose 4 of every 5 games like they have been the last couple of weeks. Let's jump down to Pittsburgh. Heather. One person asked, is he going to make trades? Somebody else now wants to know when Kyle Dubas is going to make trades. Heather says, what is the timeline for trades to start? And also, is Drew O'Connor part of the Penguins' future or an asset they want to trade and perhaps re-sign in the offseason? More often than not, whenever you trade a player away, you don't re-sign him in the offseason. It just doesn't happen very often. Usually, especially if they walk to free agency and they're an unrestricted free agent, they see what's out there and typically they decide that, well, either I'm getting paid more money somewhere else or I'm going to get a better opportunity somewhere else. I know what's behind that door with the Pittsburgh Penguins. I know what my role is going to be. I know what my job is going to be. But maybe if I go to this team, maybe if I go to the Colorado Avalanche, because they need cheap help in the bottom 6, maybe if I go there and I'm playing with players like that and I'm playing under a coach like that, maybe it's better for my career advancement. Maybe if I take a 1-year prove-it deal with Chicago and I get elevated ice time and I get power play time, maybe that's better for the advancement of my career. So I don't see the trade him and re-sign him thing. And I think the same goes for Marcus Pettersson. But I would say the timeline is now. I would say that right now you look at it and a trade can go down at any moment. Kyle Dubas is working the phones. Every general manager is working the phones, especially with the week and a half, 2 weeks off for the Four Nations face-off. I think there's going to be a lot of chatter, but maybe not a lot of movement during the Four Nations face-off. So I think a lot of people are trying to get work done beforehand. And then after, if the work isn't done, it's going to be a sprint to the trade deadline. So I think right now is the timeline. I think you could see it at any moment right now. And as far as whether or not O'Connor is part of the future, if somebody comes with an offer that the Penguins are happy with, he's gone. But somebody has to come with an offer. Drew O'Connor is an interesting player because he does all the right things. He says all the right things, but the results just don't follow all the time. They did last year. And when they did, look at what he was. He was a guy that people were saying, hey, he should be a top 6 guy the remainder of his time in Pittsburgh. I saw some people saying that. Was that a bit much? Was that a bit prisoner of the moment? Yes, it was. He's not that guy. He's not that capable. But he does all the right things, and he plays in every facet of the game at a very high level. He utilizes his body more so this year than he has in the past. I think he still needs to start utilizing his size a little bit more, but he utilizes his speed. He forechecks with aggression. He forechecks with relentless abandon, reckless abandon. That's the wording. And I think that he's a player that a lot of teams are going to look at and say, man, we could do a lot with a guy like that in the bottom six. But he doesn't finish. He doesn't score. He has 6 goals all year this year. And like I mentioned, there is a 30-game goal drought that is going to hang over his head and is going to be a red flag for a lot of teams in the trade market. So is he part of the Penguins' future? I'm sure they'd love to re-sign him. But if a team comes calling and offers something that they probably shouldn't for Drew O'Connor, but they do anyway because they think that's a piece that'll help get him over the hump, I think the Penguins pull the trigger. What is that piece? If somebody offers you a second for Drew O'Connor, you take it. I doubt it's going to happen, but like that's the bar. Second, maybe a third. If somebody offers a third, I think you take that deal. For a pending UFA, I think that's exactly what you do. Anything less than that, I think there's a conversation. I think it's a debate, and I think it's going to depend on how much Mike Sullivan and Kyle Dubas value bringing O'Connor back next season. Let's go to Evan, who says, dropping my question now because I have class at the same time as of this live. Just use some AirPods. No, I'm just kidding. Don't do that. Actually pay attention in class. That's important. We're not going to perpetuate poor whatever. We're moving on. But do you think the Penguins are missing out on some extra value by likely not trading Rickard Rakell at the deadline? Yeah, that's an interesting question, Evan, because we have heard reports out of The Athletic from Rob Rossi and Josh Yowie at times that the Penguins are probably going to hold on to Rickard Rakell, unlikely to trade him before the deadline, more likely to potentially move him in the offseason. So what does that do to his value? While at the trade deadline, you look at it and you say teams look at where they're at, they know what they want, and Rickard Rakell is going to fit the mold 9 times out of 10, and he might be one of the best players potentially available 9 times out of 10 at this deadline. They're willing to overpay for a guy like that, especially when you have years remaining on the contract. You have control of that contract. You're not just buying a rental. You're buying a player that's going to stick around for the next couple of seasons and could be part of a couple of runs and not just one. But a lot of that's going to be the same in the offseason. He'll still have 2 years left on his contract. Not only that, his contract will take up less of the projected cap hit next year because the salary cap now is expected to skyrocket to levels we don't even know, right? We were expecting it to go to a certain number. Now they've canceled escrow because they're ahead when it comes to how much money they've made this year. So it's going to go up even more, which is going to make his salary cap much easier to move and much more palatable for a lot of teams around the league. So I think because of that, his value is not going to be very different. And I think his value to the Penguins, as I said earlier when talking in the 3 stars, it's a good thing that Sidney Crosby has Rickard Rakell and Brian Rust, because otherwise he'd probably be smacking his head against the wall playing extended time, meaning multiple weeks at a time, with guys like Anthony Beauvillier and Drew O'Connor, guys that just aren't finishing, guys that just can't do it night in and night out at the level of a guy like Rickard Rakell. So do you give up a little bit of value? Yes, because there's going to be a little less desperation, but I don't think that it's a substantial amount. Let's go over to Heather, who has another one and says, is there a market for guys like Noel Acciari and Blake Lizotte, although they are both signed through next season? I don't want to move on from Blake Lizotte. I don't. I like him. Honestly, I thought he was decent as a third-line center, and that's an option that's always nice to have as a guy that can bounce between third and fourth line center, but he's a great fourth line center. He's very good. His offensive numbers have fallen off a cliff, mainly because, well, he's playing with Noel Acciari, who we'll get to in just a second, but he's also playing with Matt Nieto. You can't do very much offensively when those are the guys that are trying to help you score. But I think there's probably a market for Lizotte, but I don't think he's going to be on the market, so I think we can end the conversation there. Noel Acciari is a guy that coming into the season, I thought if he had a good year by the trade deadline, there might be somebody that says we need a fourth liner, we need a guy with grit, we need a guy that fits the mold of a playoff grinder. Acciari's that guy, especially if he's playing at a high level. He was playing at a high level in the first month of the season. He was playing at a high level, I think, in the second month of the season, if I'm not mistaken. Since then, he's fallen off. He's struggling. He certainly isn't doing anything offensively, but he never expected to do anything offensively. His defense has fallen off, though. His ability to, his physicality is always going to be there, but his penalty killing ability has fallen off. And as a result, you've seen a fall off from the entire Penguins penalty kill. I just don't know if there's a market for Acciari right now. There is a world in which he would have had a market, but I think that they've missed the mark on that. I think they missed their opportunity on that, especially for a guy making $2 million this and next to give you no offense, no expectation of offense. And right now, he's not giving you very much in the way of good defensive hockey either. Let's go to Pittsburgh Heather. Again, she's jumping all in. I love it, Pittsburgh Heather. Good interaction. We love it. Is Gino's injury one where they should really consider shutting him down for the season? Or does week to week mean he could be back before March? I think that my expectation is he's not going to play before the Four Nations face-off, which means before March is an interesting timeline because you go to the Four Nations in the second week of February. That's 5 more games, I believe, on the schedule between now and then. And then you have 2 weeks off. I would imagine he's back right before the end, or right at the end of the Four Nations face-off, and he's ready to go out of that break. Especially because before Mike Sullivan said he was week to week at practice the other day, Rob Rossi put in The Athletic that he's only going to be out, quote, a few weeks. So with that in mind, no, it's not one that they should consider shutting him down for the rest of the year, especially if it's not as severe as it looked. I understand if you watched that game, just saw that and didn't hear anything about it afterwards, it looked bad. It looked like, okay, he's done. But fortunately, the Penguins dodged a bullet on that. So too did Evgeny Malkin. Seems like he's going to be back before March, which is right after the Four Nations face-off. So no, I don't think they're going to end up shutting him down for the season, simply because look around, they need him. Even if he's only scoring 10 points in 20 games like he did before going into this injury, they need Evgeny Malkin because there's just nobody else that can elevate their game to a level that is going to help the Penguins on offense. Let's go to Evan, who says, some fans are claiming that they want the Penguins to lose and tank for the rest of this season. Are you hoping the Penguins go on a run after the trade deadline and risk getting a bad pick and missing or making the playoffs? Personally, and again, this is my belief, as somebody who sits in this chair and talks about this team 4 days a week on recording, it's much more fun to do that when the team is successful than when the team is not. So I would rather watch and talk about good hockey. So I'm never going to root for a team to lose or tank. Do I see the upside in that? Yes. Because while I haven't dove deep into who's available, I haven't dove deep into what they look like, I haven't dove deep into a lot of these prospects, I do know for a fact that the top 4 is very talented. And any one of those 4 would immediately become either 1 or 2 in the Penguins prospect ranking, depending on where they are with Rutger McGroarty. Immediately, no matter what. Over Brunick, over Cruz Lucius, over Ville Koivunen, over everybody. Any of those top 4 in that draft, you can immediately put at 1 or 2 in the Penguins prospect ranking. That would be great. But as a person that enjoys watching sports, I don't want to watch them lose. If you're somebody that's going to say, hey, listen, they've been so bad, I'm not going to watch, by all means, root for them to lose. Hope that you wake up to an ESPN notification of a loss. You do you. But as somebody who's planning on watching all of these games and talking about them, I would much rather watch them win. I would much rather watch good hockey, because that game that we watched on Monday against San Jose was like grating my brain with a cheese grater. It was bad hockey. I don't want to watch that. So I would much rather watch them win, even if it comes at the expense of a better prospect. It might be better for the Penguins in the long run, but as a viewer and as somebody who covers the team, as somebody who talks about the team 4 days a week, I would much rather watch good hockey. That's all I'm going to say. Let's go to Jim Fry, who says, how can the Penguins bring up guys from Wilkes-Barre without just putting them into fourth line roles in minutes and not rustle feathers of players currently on the second and third line? I don't think it's going to happen very much, but whenever the Penguins get past the trade deadline, depending on how much movement occurs, there's going to be more spots open. So less feathers to ruffle per se. But I think you have to just sit down and have honest conversations. And it's on Mike Sullivan to have those conversations of, hey, this guy has been very good in the minors and we want to see what he's got. And because of that, your role is going to diminish a little bit. And most players, especially if they've been around all season and have contributed to where the Penguins are at, which is a very bad spot, are probably going to understand that. They're probably not going to be happy, but they're probably going to understand, oh, okay, Ville Koivunen should not play fourth line minutes. Ville Koivunen should play third line minutes. Vasily Ponomarev shouldn't be a fourth line center when he's given the opportunity to play in the NHL and shouldn't be given 7 minutes of ice time a night. He should be given 12 to 15 if we really want to see what he is in a role that he's actually going to play whenever he moves up to the NHL level, which is a third line player. So I think that it's incumbent upon Mike Sullivan to have those conversations to mitigate the amount of feathers that end up getting ruffled. And how can they do it without putting them in fourth line roles? Simple. Bring them up and say, hey, listen, this is a guy that's going to play this because this is a guy that we want him to play this. If it's Rutger McGroarty, who Blues Nation asked a question about that we're going to get to in a minute, you're not going to play Rutger McGroarty on the fourth. You're probably going to play him on the third. And shoot, depending on how he's playing, you might give him a chance in the top six. There's openings, certainly. So you might give him a chance there. So I think that it's simply, as far as trying to keep the peace, one, players understand. Late in the season, especially if you trade away players at the deadline, players understand that, hey, listen, this season's probably a wash. We get it. You have to look forward to the future. And I think it's also on Mike Sullivan to sit those players down and kind of explain to them, this is what's going to happen. And I think for that, these guys are professionals. They'll understand. Let's go to Evan, who asks about Ville Koivunen, who says, do you see Koivunen getting ice time this season? He's dominating at the AHL level, but I don't know how polished he is for the NHL level. This is Koivunen's first year in North America playing professional hockey. He got snubbed from the AHL All-Star game. I agree with Tony Andrikaitis on that one. He covers the Wilkes-Barre Scranton Penguins, but he covers the entire AHL on InsideTheAHL.com. Koivunen might get a chance, but again, it's a matter of how many people and how many opportunities do they have to give out. If it's going to be down to Koivunen or McGroarty, they would probably rather give it to McGroarty and get his feet wet if they can only choose one. Maybe even a guy like Vasily Ponomarev would get that opportunity over Koivunen because last year he was ahead of him in that list. Maybe he's ahead of him once again. So I think that there's a chance that he does, but it just depends on how many opportunities the Penguins are going to give post-trade deadline. Because remember, after the trade deadline, they only have a handful of call-ups that they can actually make. They only have, I believe it's 4 or 5 call-ups that they can make from the trade deadline to the end of the season. So you have to be very choosy with who you bring up. Koivunen being on that list is realistic. Whether or not he's at the top of that list, I don't know. I would have to imagine, like I said, McGroarty's up there ahead of him, and Ponomarev is probably close as well. Speaking of Rutger McGroarty, Blues Nation says, any thoughts on how Rutger is coming along? Every single report has been not just positive, but extremely positive about Rutger McGroarty. Every single highlight, every single game that I have been able to watch, which is not a lot of AHL hockey, but I try to watch as much as I can. He's looked good. He's figuring it out. The skating is the skating, right? That's the biggest bugaboo. It's been the biggest bugaboo for him probably since he was like 12. People have been writing about his skating. But outside of that, everything else is starting to sharpen up. And I think that is phenomenal for the Penguins. This is a guy that by next year, they probably want him to be an everyday NHL player. Is it as soon as they'd hoped? No, I'm sure when they traded away Braden Yeager, they were hoping that by the end of this season, he was going to be ready. But things take time. And when he's 20 years old, you can take the one extra year to make sure that whenever he does get that opportunity, whenever he does make that jump for good, he is more prepared for it. He's more ready for it. And he's starting at a much better level. So I like what is going on with Rutger McGroarty. Everything I've heard and everything I've saw is very, very positive. Let's go to Pittsburgh fan 412, who says, what are the chances about Pettersson, DOC, Achari, Nieto, and Beauvillier all getting dealt? 0. There's movement that is going to be coming. Not that much. Not that much. Last year, we heard reports of everybody outside of Crosby is available. And yet, by the trade deadline, who was traded? Jake Gensel, who we saw coming for months because that's what everybody was talking about. Chad Ruhwedel and Magnus Hellberg. Those were the only players traded. So there might be a lot of discussion about, is Noel Acciari attractive to a playoff team? Anthony Beauvillier has had a much better season this year than he did last year. Can he be traded? Could he be of use to another team? And yeah, those conversations should happen because, yeah, Beauvillier makes sense as a potential trade target. But whether he's a trade target versus somebody that they can actually find a trade for, those are two different stories. And I just don't think that all of those players, in particular, a guy like Matt Nieto, who I hate the bash of the guy, but he's coming off of major knee injuries and he hasn't really shown very much. I understand he's a pending UFA, which gives you a little bit of added stock, but I don't think there's any trade stock right now in Matt Nieto. So I don't think you're going to move away from him. And I just don't see Noel Acciari being a guy that teams are going to be falling over to bring in. Maybe if the Penguins are like, just give us a conditional pick or just give us future considerations. That's been tossed around a lot for Penguins trades. Just to offload Noel Acciari to open up $2 million for next year and to open up a roster spot for next year. Maybe they do, but I would put that under the unlikely category. Same with Nieto. Pettersson, I think, is as good as gone. DOC, we talked about earlier. I think it all depends on what the offers are, because I think there is a world in which the Penguins say, you know, we would rather just hold on to O'Connor and try to re-sign him. And Beauvillier, again, depending on his market. I think his market's probably fairly decent based on the season that he's been having, but you never know. And also, how much movement is there league-wide? You'll have to wait and see. As of right now, there hasn't been much. But again, can the Canucks just trade JT Miller so we can get this party started? I mean, Colorado stopped waiting, but that's because Colorado had a decision to make. And as soon as they got a deal that was halfway decent, they had to take it. Not a lot of other teams are in that position. So they'll wait till the trade deadline. So as soon as Vancouver gets their crap together, I think it kicks off some movement. We get to actually see how active these teams are, who thinks they're a buyer, who thinks they're a seller for this deadline period. Let's go down to JR, who says, how soon before they bring in Gino's replacement? Are you talking about, I would imagine you're talking about at second line center. They don't have one currently in the organization. They don't. Tristan Brose has been a nice player, a nice piece, but I don't think anybody projects him to go out there and be a second line center as of now. He had a really good final year in college, and he's having a really good first year at the AHL, but I don't think anybody is still projecting him to be a second line center. Certainly not at the level of Malkin. That's an unfair assessment, an unfair comparison to even loft on that kid's shoulders. But right now, as a general second line center, I don't think we're expecting that out of Tristan Brose. So there's none in the organization. That's why yesterday, when we were talking about the Penguins and the Buffalo Sabres potentially being trade partners, I had a little bit of interest in Dylan Cozens because he can be a second line center at the National Hockey League. He's proven that he's capable of being a second line center at the National Hockey League. He's proven that he can score 30 goals in the National Hockey League. He hasn't done it the last 2 seasons, which is why he's potentially on his way out in Buffalo. But I think that the Penguins are going to start looking this offseason. You have to. One, because Malkin's heading into the last year of his contract, and it's widely expected that he's not going to sign another one, that he's heading over to Russia, and his time in North America is done after next season. You need to make a plan. So I would think it starts next offseason. If it doesn't start at this trade deadline, there's only a handful of players, 2 players. Yeah, there's only 2 players that I would say would come in or be even on the Penguins' radar remotely that could be considered anything close to a Gino replacement. That's Trevor Zegras, if they move him to center, and that's Dylan Cozens. And again, I would file those under the unlikely category, but I would put them on the Penguins' radar as players that the Pens should, not that they are, but they should be interested in. Outside of that, this summer, they need to look for it. It might not be available. They might not be able to find it, but they certainly need to start looking for it. Let's go to Brian's question next, who asks, what trade scenarios and returns would make you say Dubas did a superb job for the future of the organization? Just curious at what that would entail. I've really liked a lot of the moves that Kyle Dubas has made from the Jake Gensel trade on. He's taken some swings and he's had some misses, right? He's brought in some players that have not worked out. But for the most part, his trades have been spot on. You traded basically nothing for Philip Tomasino, and he looks like a player that, at least for the next couple of seasons, could be a nice piece in your middle six. He traded for Cody Glass for absolutely nothing, and while I think he is certainly miscast right now as a second-line center, he's a player that I wouldn't mind keeping around for a couple of years in a transition stage for the organization. Decent player, you traded nothing to get him. Same thing for Kevin Hayes. Kevin Hayes this year has been great for the locker room. This year has been good for the power play. And you traded nothing to get him. And you also got a really good draft pick in return. Those trades I've liked. If I see similar things leading into the deadline, I'll say he did a good job. If he gets a second round pick and a B+ or A- prospect for Marcus Pettersson, I'll say he did a superb job. If he gets a third or a second for Drew O'Connor, I'll say he did a superb job. Same thing goes for Grzelcyk. I don't think they're going to trade Grzelcyk, but if they trade Grzelcyk, who's on the expiring contract, which means he could be a good rental for a team that needs a power play 2 specialist, if he gets a third or second, I'll say Dubas did a superb job. If he continues to do what he's been doing in the trade market, I'll like his trade deadline. So if he follows it, it's great. If he gets a 4th round pick or a 3rd round pick and a C or D prospect for Marcus Pettersson, I'll be a little upset because I think everybody knows that Pettersson is worth more than that. If he gets the same thing for Drew O'Connor, he gets a 6th or a 7th round pick for Drew O'Connor, I'll be a little upset because at that point I would have rather just re-signed Drew O'Connor at 27 years old than having a 7th round pick in 2026 or 2027 or whenever. So I think that's how I'm looking at this deadline. If he continues on the path that he set, which all indications are that he is going to, then I'll probably be happy with what he does. Let's go to Jay again, who says, what are the Pens going to do with Jari? Should they keep looking to trade him? They should 100% keep looking to trade him. I don't think anybody is looking back at him. I don't. And I don't think anybody is going to look back at him for the rest of the season, because unless something crazy happens at the NHL level, knock on wood, Tristan Jarry is probably not coming back up to the big leagues this season. At the very least, he's not coming up anytime soon, right? Whenever he was sent down, Kyle Dubas went on the GM show with Josh Getzov and likened it to a full rebuild of a car. That's going to take time. And whenever your GM says that, that's also going to go around the league and everybody's going to say, man, this guy is really broken. Why would we trade for him when he has that much time left on his contract for that much money? So should they look to keep trading him? Yes. Nobody's looking back. With that in mind, what do they do with Tristan Jarry? The buyout is not palatable. I'm telling you right now. It's a 6-year buyout, which years 2 and 3 are $4 and $5 million a piece. And then after that, I believe it goes down to under $1 million. But that's 6 years of dead cap for Tristan Jarry. Add that to the fact, that Kyle Dubas is very outspoken about not liking retaining salary in trades and not liking buyouts, calling it often a worst case scenario, which we might be approaching there with Tristan Jarry, but still, worst case scenario, buyout's not coming. So unless Tristan Jarry turns it around so well in the AHL that somebody wants to bail out the Penguins, I think you're going to see him in the organization next year. At what capacity, that depends. But I do think that as of right now, I don't see a way that the Penguins get out from under Tristan Jarry. They're more likely to get out from Ryan Graves than they are from Tristan Jarry at the moment. Let's go to Fateco, who says, I watched the video earlier. What is a realistic trade for Bowen Byram, and what would Buffalo want from us? Rickard Rakell? I don't think it would be an NHL player for an NHL player. If you look at Buffalo, the reason we talked about it is because Elliot Friedman of Sportsnet said that a lot of the players that Buffalo is looking to move fit the mold of what the Penguins have been acquiring since March. That's why. And then we looked at who's on the trade list, and Bowen Byram's up there. He's a good left shot defenseman. You could pair him with Owen Pickering. It makes sense for the Penguins. I don't think it's Rickard Rakell, though. What would Buffalo, the worst team in the Eastern Conference, want with a Rickard Rakell right now? No, nothing. What they would want is the salary cap space from not having to re-sign Byram. They would want probably a 1st or 2nd round pick, likely a 2nd round pick. I don't think it would get up as high as a 1st. And they'd probably want one of the Penguins forward prospects, one of their better ones, one of the ones that you actually know their name. And I think that's where the conversation would start. As far as how much more they would get or how much less they would get, I don't know what Buffalo wants. I don't know what Buffalo needs as far as their prospect pool. I don't know what Buffalo needs as far as their NHL roster, because seems like they have a lot of good pieces, right? It seems like they have a lot of good faces, a lot of good young faces at the NHL level. But I think that it would start with, at the very least, a second-round pick and probably a prospect that, if you don't pay attention to prospects, you would at least know their name. Let's go to JR, who wants to know. I'm just going to collect a couple of these questions here before we keep going. But let's go to JR next. JR says, who in the AHL Wilkes-Barre Scranton Penguins team do you think will be starting for the Penguins next year? I mean, can we count Owen Pickering? Is that a free space right now? Because he's currently playing on the Wilkes-Barre Scranton Penguins, and I think there is no doubt in my mind that he will start next year at the NHL level. So Owen Pickering, that's one. Rutger McGroarty, that's two. And I would think that there's two more in my eyes, depending on what happens over the next couple of weeks leading into the deadline, depending on what happens throughout the summer. But I could see Jack St. Ivany clawing his way back to the NHL level. I can. He had a rough start to the year. He suffered an injury when he went back down to the AHL and hasn't been able to kind of put it back together. But I would imagine the door will be open for Jack St. Ivany. And I would imagine the door will be open for one of, if not both, potentially, Vasily Ponomarev and specifically Billy Koivunen. I think Ponomarev is, I'm not going to go as far as to say that he will. I would say the door's probably open for him. And again, what does the Penguins forward core look like? But I would think Koivunen is higher on that list at this point. I would think Koivunen has jumped Ponomarev as far as next season to start. He's been really good, like I mentioned. He got snubbed from the AHL All-Star game, but he is very, very high in rookie ranks in the AHL, is Ville Koivunen. So I would put it at four names that are likely, in my eyes, to be given a spot at the start of training camp to say, hey, as long as you don't stink, you're going to be in the NHL. And that's Jack St. Ivany, that's Owen Pickering, that's Rutger McGroarty, and that's Ville Koivunen. Pittsburgh fan 412 asks a question that's going to save me some breath. Says, any chance Gino gets traded? No, there isn't. He has a full no movement clause. He wants to finish his career in Pittsburgh. Ownership wants him to finish his career in Pittsburgh, and Kyle Dubas is committed to making that happen. So it's not going to happen. If Evgeny Malkin's going to finish his career in Pittsburgh after next season, he's not going to get traded. Let's go to JR again, who says, okay, then, trade proposal for this year for Buffalo. Cousins and his $7.1 million deal with 5 years left on it, which is a massive part as to why he's lower on my list of potential trade targets to bring in. For Pettersson, Achari, and a fifth. That would be great for the Penguins. It would be great to get a second-line center for a guy that you know you're going to get rid of. I mean, maybe the return isn't as much as you'd want. And freeing up Noel Achari's $2 million in cap for next year. I wouldn't pull the trigger on it, but also Buffalo wouldn't pull the trigger on it. Buffalo wouldn't say, yeah, we can get Marcus Pettersson, who can just as well walk out the door in a couple months. Noel Achari, who doesn't help us at all this year or next and doesn't really fit with our identity, and a fifth-round pick, which is not very much for a second-line center. I don't think Buffalo would be interested in this at all. And even on the Penguins side, I think that, I know Cousins, though, that 7.1 is a lot to take. That's what kind of puts pause for me when talking about Cousins. But trading away a pending UFA, a player that's not giving you much, and a fifth for potentially a second-line center, it's hard to turn that down if you're the Penguins. Easy to turn down if you're the Buffalo Sabres looking at this job or at this trade. Let's go to Brian, who says, Nick, 2 trains leave the station at the same time. One's traveling 50 kilometers per hour and the other at 60 with 2 stops. Is the answer to which arrives first? The Flyers suck. I just wanted to highlight this because first of all, I didn't read the whole thing and I was very confused as to where it was going. The Flyers are an interesting organization. I'll go as far as to say that, but that's it. Let's go to the next question here. Do you think Emil Bemstrom is worth a roster spot again? He's also having a pretty decent year. He's the one guy that is going to the AHL All-Star game. He's been very good at the AHL level, but that might be the ceiling there for Emil Bemstrom. It just might. He hasn't shown anything at the NHL level to make me think otherwise. He didn't show anything last year at the NHL level to make me think it was going to work with the Penguins. I was surprised when they brought him back. Less surprised that he hasn't gotten a single second of NHL ice time, and also not surprised that he's pretty good at the AHL level. Let's not forget that whenever the Penguins acquired via the waivers, Jansen Harkins last year. Everybody looked at his AHL numbers and said, man, he's really good at the American Hockey League level. He scores a lot of points at the American Hockey League level. And then he went out and scored 0 goals in 40-plus games and only scored once, which was a shootout winner. Crazy season for Jansen Harkins, but some players are great in the AHL. They just can't translate it to the NHL. And I feel like Emil Bemstrom fits into that list. I would much rather see Koivunen, Ponomarev, McGroarty, even Poulin again. I'd rather see Poulin get a chance again over watching Emil Bemstrom get a shot here late in the season. Let's go to Pittsburgh Heather, who says, are the Jets still interested in Marcus Pettersson? If so, could Jaeger be part of the return? I've seen a lot of people comment this. A lot of people loved Braden Jaeger. Don't get me wrong. I did too. The Jets are not going to part with Braden Jaeger for anything that you want to give them. Let's just put it that way. You're not going to be able to get Jaeger. I think the Jets are still interested in Marcus Pettersson. The reports have indicated that they were one of the teams. It was Winnipeg, Edmonton, Vancouver, I think, are the 3 names that I've heard. So I would imagine they're still interested, especially because they are the best team in the Western Conference, and adding a nice defensive defenseman probably goes a long way for them in the playoffs. But I don't think that you're getting Braden Jaeger back. As much as I'd love to see him back, as much as Kyle Dubas would probably love to get him back, I don't think, unless you trade somebody ridiculous, who the Penguins aren't, you're not going to get Braden Jaeger back from the Winnipeg Jets. Let's go to Flux CC, shout out, says, Kevin Weeks just said that Brant Clark is a healthy scratch that may be set to be traded. That's a great trade target for Kyle Dubas. What do you give up for him? I'd have to look more into Brant Clark. Obviously, I think he would be a nice addition for the Penguins. Obviously, it fits. If he's truly, truly set to be traded, it fits what the Penguins mold has been. We want young players that have fallen out of favor with their teams that we can give an opportunity to, and we don't have to pay a lot for. That last part's probably the one thing that I have to look more into. How much is Brant Clark worth in the trade market? I think it's probably going to be a lot, because he's not one of these guys that has been out of favor for a long time. He's one of these guys that, as of right now, it's just starting. So I think that probably takes the Penguins out of contention for this, probably puts him at the bottom of the list, below guys like Nick Robertson, below guys like Nils Hoglander, who've been kind of on that list and on the shelf and kind of on that trade atmosphere, that trade bubble longer. But I would still definitely look into Brant Clark. I plan on looking into Brant Clark now, because I didn't see that he's going to be a healthy scratch again. That's interesting. Let's go and finish things off with Fateco, who says, let's talk Ryan Graves. Oh, I did for a second. That wasn't enough. I saw a stat that numerous goalies have more points than him. He has 0. Now, he's a defensive defender, but he hasn't shown much of that either. What's next for Ryan Graves? He's gotten a couple of games here, and it hasn't looked pretty. But then again, let's remember, the Penguins as a whole have not looked pretty over the last couple of games. And I would say more of Graves' struggles over the last couple of games are the fact that Ryan Shea has been abysmal and Graves is playing next to him. I don't think Graves has been good, but he certainly hasn't been the worst of that pairing, if you get what I'm saying. Points-wise, I'm not worried about Ryan Graves with points. I never am. I mean, he's a guy that does have some offensive capabilities. He does like to shoot the puck a lot, although a lot of the times it doesn't get to the net. But points is not what I'm overly concerned about with Ryan Graves. With that said, it's been a rough go of it for him. He's been better this year than last. As I've said before, bar was very low for that one. So where are we at with him? What's next for him? I'd have to imagine they're going to look around with the increased salary cap next year and say, does anybody want to give him a change of scenery? Like I said, it's easier to move a defenseman. It's easier to move a forward than it is a goaltender. So I don't think it works for Jari. It might work for Ryan Graves. We'll have to wait and see, but it might, because his $4+ million contract is going to look a lot easier when the salary cap goes up $10 million in 5 more months. So that's probably what's next for him. I don't see him getting an extended run here at the end of the year unless, no, he might get an extended period of playing time because Pettersson might be out the door If Grzelcyk's out the door as well, then you really have a lot of ice time to fill. Pickering's going to be up, but Graves is going to be in the lineup a lot. So I could see him getting some ice time once Pettersson gets traded. And then I could see the Penguins trying to move on to that from that contract in year 2 in the summer. Last summer, Dubas didn't say anything about trying to trade Graves. He said that they want him to come back, want him to build his confidence up, but he's been better, but I wouldn't say he's been anywhere near what that contract is. And I'm not sure the Penguins are going to sit there and say, well, we'll wait for year 3. We'll see how year 3 goes. And then we'll decide on whether or not we want to try to trade him. No, I think they're going to make some calls this summer. And maybe, just maybe, another team says a change of pace, a fresh scenery might help this guy with the opportunity to play with a defensive partner that actually meshes well with his game. His game doesn't mesh well with Karlsson. His game doesn't mesh well with Letang. And when that's the case, there's not very many places that you can go. There's not very many places that you can get deployed where you can build your confidence. So I think a fresh start is needed. Will he get one? It depends if somebody else wants to take a risk on him. But that's going to do it for this episode of the Tip of the Ice-Burgh Live. Thank you guys so much for tuning into this one. Remember, you can find us on YouTube at Tip of the Ice-Burgh. Make sure you like, share, subscribe if you liked this video, or you can check us out anywhere you get your podcast from. We'll see you guys next time.